Phytophthora cinnamomi. It's possible you haven't heard of this Phytophthora. If you're from California, it's probably more likely, if I was to guess that you knew one Phytophthora, I would guess that you know Phytophthora ramorum, the cause of sudden oak death. But Phytophthora cinnamomi arguably is a more important pathogen. It's just that one of the unique characteristics about it is that it is a global pathogen. And when we look across the scope of the entire world, one would have to argue that, or there's a very clear case to argue that Phytophthora cinnamomi puts a broader range of species at risk and a greater number of forests at risk than Phytophthora ramorum as of right now in January 2018. Now, Phytophthora cinnamomi is got these characteristics that make it a very difficult pathogen to confront from a management perspective. The first and foremost of those is that it has a very broad host range, perhaps the broadest host range of any known Phytophthora. It's also very, very damaging on some species. Phytophthora cinnamomi is able to infect a wide range of plants, not just in terms of species, but also in terms of the characteristics of those plants. It is a devastating disease on some species of trees. It can be very damaging to eucalyptus, to oaks, and to some other common broadleaf species as well. However, Phytophthora cinnamomi also infects a broad range of shrubs, herbs, perhaps even grasses. And that makes it a very difficult pathogen to manage, because in many forests, one could look around and look at, do a general survey of the biodiversity of the flora, and you could expect that most of what you find are likely susceptible to the pathogen. Okay, so Phytophthora cinnamomi, unlike Phytophthora ramorum, which is known as a kind of, in some respects, kind of unique because it is a aerially transmitted pathogen, Phytophthora cinnamomi is more typical of what we think of, typical behavior of Phytophthora. What's ironic about that is that in forest pathology, our vision of what is typical for Phytophthora is shaped by the characteristics of Phytophthora cinnamomi. That is to say that it's such an important pathogen, it has shaped the way people look at Phytophthora as a group. Phytophthora cinnamomi is a it is a root pathogen. It infects the roots of susceptible hosts. That's where it sporulates. It can grow into the roots of those hosts, kill root tissue, and ultimately kill individual trees. The Phytophthora cinnamomi kills its hosts from the ground up, and that means that's different than Phytophthora ramorum and sudden oak death. With Phytophthora cinnamomi, even a tree like this coast live oak, if it's infected and killed by Phytophthora cinnamomi, the entire individual will be dead. Now contrast that with an aerially spread pathogen that would, say, infect the bole of a tree and kill the tree through a process like girdling. In these Mediterranean forests, most of these species can resprout as an adaptation to fire. However, if the individual is killed, if the base, the below ground parts of this individual are killed, there would be no resprouting. And in that way, the entire individual is killed. So contrast that kind of root pathogen effect with aerially spread Phytophthora. There are very different outcomes on the individual that's being infected. Phytophthora cinnamomi is going to kill this entire individual, no resprouting. Whereas something like Phytophthora ramorum, which is infecting above ground, may kill the above ground tissues but leave the below ground tissues, which then can resprout. And that has a very important effect on the pathogen, or it's a very important factor in determining how pathogens change ecosystem structure. Now, if you've never heard of Phytophthora cinnamomi, you can't be blamed. If you're from California, or you're from the central coast of California, and you've never heard of this pathogen, I don't blame you. And the reason for that is because it simply hasn't been that great of had that great of an impact here in coastal California forests. Now, what I want to emphasize to you is that that is surprising. Phytophthora cinnamomi has been a devastating pathogen in other Mediterranean forests throughout the world. Mediterranean forests of Australia, and those of the Mediterranean basin in Europe. It's a risk in the Mediterranean forests in South America as well as in South Africa. However, it just simply hasn't been that important of a pathogen in coastal California forests. That's not to say that it won't kill trees. It does, and that's also not to say that it isn't here, because one of the surprising things about cinnamomi is that it is broadly distributed within California. It's unclear why it hasn't emerged as a bigger pathogen here in this part of the world. It seems to be broadly distributed enough. The hosts seem to be susceptible to it, and yet the pathogen disease just hasn't emerged at the same scale as it has in other parts of the world. Now, it's unclear, what's going on here. Is there something different about these forests that make them less susceptible? Or are we sitting on top of a ticking bomb, a ticking Phytophthora cinnamomi bomb? The many pathogens, many of the forest diseases that we look at, or essentially all forest diseases, are impacted by changes in the environment to some degree. Sometimes those changes can make those diseases less severe, and other times they can make them more severe, or even cause them to emerge when they had not been present before. As previously mentioned, one of the challenging things about Phytophthora cinnamomi is its ability to infect so many different species. So even though the structure of this ecosystem is much different, more of a savanna, one can expect that, and it's certainly true in other parts of the world, that ecosystems like this are susceptible to Phytophthora cinnamomi, and disease can emerge within them. And you can imagine that a pathogen that is effective in killing isolated trees in a savanna ecosystem could change the structure and composition severely. In fact, transforming an ecosystem from a savanna type forest to simply a grassland. Now, the other aspect of Phytophthora cinnamomi that makes it extremely challenging to manage are some of the biological characteristics of the pathogen. The organism itself is able to form very highly resilient spores that can persist in soil for many years. Phytophthora cinnamomi in particular forms two types of spores that we're concerned about. One is called a chlamydospore, which is a protein-enclosed and meltonized survival structure. It also forms a second type of spore called an oospore, which is even more environmentally resilient. These are spores that can survive in soil for at least a few years, maybe even a decade. Those spores can easily get attached to things like the bottom of your shoes, or they can get attached to animals. And in fact, in parts of the world, particularly in Australia, much of the spread of Phytophthora cinnamomi is caused by the movement of soil. These spores, like I say, they're very long-lived, and even a very small amount of soil that's moved from one field to another or from one forest to another can result in the spread of the disease. Now, that's something that's very challenging to deal with, and yet with Phytophthora cinnamomi, it does present a management solution, which is oftentimes if you can get soil off shoes, if you can get it off equipment, then you can limit the spread of the disease. And in fact, Alcoa, the major aluminum mining operation in Australia has implemented a number of procedures for cleaning their heavy equipment, and that has helped to reduce Phytophthora cinnamomi spread within Australia. Now, certainly many ecosystems there have been impacted, and because of these biological characteristics, these long-lived spores and the great diversity of hosts that Phytophthora cinnamomi can infect, it's there to stay. Phytophthora cinnamomi is there to stay in most of the ecosystems that it is able to establish in. But there are some solutions for limiting its spread to uninvaded areas, and that's important for protecting biodiversity. With Phytophthora cinnamomi and many generalist pathogens, because these pathogens impact so many different species, we often don't know what we're losing. There is a bias within ecological literature and forestry literature to studying tree species and ecosystems that have the greatest economic importance. And that's natural. We need to know how to grow loblolly pine and Douglas fir efficiently in order to support the local economies that depend on those things. There's nothing wrong with that, but it does mean that when we have an unprecedented pathogen outbreak, such as Phytophthora cinnamomi, that impacts a lot of different species, we don't know what we're losing. In the case of coast live oak, there's some understanding of why this tree is important. It is part of the landscape in coastal California, where most of the population of the state lives. People do rely on coast live oak for some very definite ecosystem benefits, provides shade, that supports wildlife, it also protects soils, and that can help with problems such as landslides and stuff like that. But in general, when we have a pathogen like cinnamomi that emerges and we start to lose species, we don't know what the impacts are. So what do we know about the consequences of these kinds of diseases? Oftentimes they are a reflection of the characteristics of the species that are most impacted. So when coast live oak is removed from an ecosystem by a disease, we find that soil temperatures go up, air temperatures go up, the production of acorns goes down, and we get a great increase in the generation of fuels, both coarse fuels and fine fuels. Now, whether those are a risk to an ecosystem characteristic that you are responsible for managing as a forester, that is one of the questions that you have to confront, either in any natural resource management. Is this impact severe enough to necessitate a response from a management agency? Is it a big enough problem in order to invest money into protecting resource? There's a good argument for the most severe diseases and insect outbreaks that it is cost effective to mitigate their impacts. That's both because of the fuels that are generated by these diseases, by the impacts to carbon sequestration, by the impacts to the provisioning of water. These are all essential ecosystem resources that people in this part of the world rely on and look to natural ecosystems to provide. Now the question becomes, how much money is responsible in order to, what is the responsible amount of funds to put towards management of these ecosystems? And that's where there's a lot of debate, there's a lot of work going on in order to try to understand where is the cost effectiveness threshold. It's probably higher than we think. We could probably afford to spend more money managing our natural ecosystems and then get a benefit in terms of fire-safe communities and reliable water supplies. However, that's the hard part of this science, getting down into really defensible and well-researched estimates of those kinds of cost and benefit trade-offs. And so there is a lot of work to be done in the ecology and management of all manner of forest health problems, whether it's insects, pathogens, and of course fire. As I mentioned previously, it's surprising that Phytophthora cinnamomi hasn't had a greater impact on California natural ecosystems. However, there is an exception to that statement, and it's that Phytophthora cinnamomi has been devastating to a few unique California ecosystems. In particular, the Ione manzanita populations of the Ione region of California. That's a narrow range endemic. Ione manzanita is highly susceptible to Phytophthora cinnamomi, and there is concern that it will actually be driven to extinction because of this root pathogen. Now, again, these are woody. Ione manzanita, it forms monodominant stands on a unique soil type. Not only is California a very large state, California has a lot of biodiversity because it's a very large state with a lot of environmental variation, but there's tremendous amount of variation in soil characteristics as well. And because of that, we have some really unique species that in our state flora. Narrow range endemics, because there aren't that many of the individual plants. Those are the kinds of plant populations, species populations that are most at risk to, they have the greatest extinction risk because of something like an unprecedented pathogen or insect outbreak. Now, let's look at this situation. Ione manzanita, a narrow range endemic. Phytophthora cinnamomi, a known very destructive pathogen with a very broad host range and tremendous ability to survive within the environment. Those characteristics mean that Phytophthora cinnamomi can persist after an individual Ione manzanita has been killed. It also suggests that the pathogen can sporulate on an adjacent plant or an adjacent ecosystem that doesn't have this Ione manzanita. For example, other woody species in chaparral communities. That's the situation where we have to be most concerned from a biodiversity perspective, because when there's a second source of sporulation, we can have continued pathogen spread even after individual hosts that we may be most concerned about have died. Now contrast that with a pathogen that is host specific. Once the host dies, the pathogen will die as well. So what that means is that host-specific pathogens oftentimes don't carry the same kind of extinction risk that a generalist pathogen would, because a generalist pathogen can continue to persist within the ecosystem, continue to infect, sporulate, and spread even after the species that we might be most concerned about from the biodiversity perspective or conservation perspective has already been killed.
I'd like to wrap up our discussion about Phytophthora cinnamomi by talking about some ecosystems outside of California. This is an example of an oak forest in the south of Spain. This is the kind of forest that has been heavily impacted in the Mediterranean basin by Phytophthora cinnamomi. This example is an area that's been managed for grazing, some livestock resources, and some areas that have been used for cork production. This stand, I think you can see here, is pretty healthy. It's pretty carefully managed, and I believe that this area, if I recall correctly, has not been invaded by cinnamomi at all, and it certainly has not been impacted by diseases caused by cinnamomi. And you can see that by contrasting this with a nearby area in the south of Portugal that has been impacted by Phytophthora cinnamomi for a couple of decades. It's thought that cinnamomi invaded these areas maybe a century or two ago and has emerged as really a devastating disease, both economically and in some respects culturally. These are hot, dry forests dominated by Quercus suber, that's cork oak. It's native native oak to the southern Iberian Peninsula. And the disease, of course, is infecting a lot of different species. It's killing the oaks, but it's not necessarily killing the shrubby species that you're seeing in the understory there. And so one of the impacts of cinnamomi in this area is to transform these forests, transform these ecosystems from forests into shrublands. And that is really problematic in combination with the net movement of people from rural areas and into the cities. The forests in Portugal and Spain have densified, and that has complicated wildland fire management. Portugal, forest resources in Portugal have been in the news recently, mostly because of devastating wildfire impacts. And Phytophthora cinnamomi may be playing a role in that by reducing more fire-resilient overstory trees and turning these stands into something more more dense. However, something that I really want to emphasize about cork oak and these forests is the economic importance of cork. Now, oftentimes, especially in North America, we think about the utility of forest resources being in wood or in water or in carbon sequestration, those sorts of things. But in the south of Spain and Portugal, this is the primary natural cork production region. And you're seeing that here. This is harvested cork. There's a marking on that tree in the foreground indicating the year that it was harvested. You can, it takes a lot of skill, but you can harvest cork from these trees once every about 8 years. And it's fairly valuable, somewhere along on the order of $60 to $100 per tree. And since cork oak is just a native part of the ecosystem, you can earn some income in an area that is fairly economically, doesn't have a lot of economic diversity. You can increase your income as a private landowner pretty simply just by growing trees that are already present on your land. It does take skill to do this, to harvest cork sustainably, and there is a whole infrastructure that's set up for moving cork and processing it and making cork products. Primarily, of course, we're talking about cork that's used in enology, in the making of wine, but historically, cork was used for all kinds of things before plastics really came to dominate a lot of the uses of cork as a sealer for jars or soda bottles or all manner of things. But it's still a very important part of the local economy, and Phytophthora cinnamomi is having a very serious impact on it. In fact, on cork production, and in fact, cork prices have in some respects have risen, and there has been a perception that there's less cork available, and that has even led to some wine producers switching from cork to synthetics.